The Ipiranga transaction was one of the most complex transactions I have worked on. You probably have maybe more complex transactions, but for me, it was absolutely the most complex transactions. It involved three listed companies as a client, acquiring three listed companies from a very complex family group. So I'm talking about Braskem, Ultrapar, Petrobras acquiring the Ipiranga companies. Tell me a little bit about the context. Where were we in terms of timing? How was Brazil back then? Who was Ultrapar? Why were they doing this transaction?
Okay, Jose, if we go back to the beginning, all right, I personally have had a relationship with Ultrapar for a long time. I took Ultrapar, public when I was running Latin America for Morgan Stanley,
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
and I have known the company and had great admiration and respect for the company, in particular for Fabio Schwartzman. Fabio
Okay.
Schwartzman had a number of management roles at Ultrapar, and he's a friend of mine, and he's a brilliant, he's been a brilliant CEO and just a brilliant professional, overall. So knowing the company Ultrapar from the beginning, when you take a company public, obviously you have an in-depth knowledge of that company.
Mhm.
It's one of the most important things that a company may do, in its history. So understanding that, clearly understanding the intricacies of the equity market and the meaning of having a publicly traded company. And I had done other equity transactions, as we've spoken about, in terms of the Brazilian marketplace, obviously before the Ipiranga transaction. So it's the knowledge of Ultrapar. It's the leadership of the Ultrapar team working in conjunction with you, me, Ian Reed, in terms of that transaction. So it's Fabio Schwartzman, it's Andre Kovri, it's Eduardo Toledo. It's the Ultrapar team that was extremely talented as well, working with us. And then, integrating that team in with the Braskem and the Petrobras teams. The interaction with Ultrapar and the management of that process was also quite complex. And you're right, balancing the needs, the timetable, the logistics, the legal, the due diligence, the regulatory aspects of all that is a complicated task. But when the teams are united with the same goals and everyone's working in the same direction, and certainly on the banking side with you and Ian Reed and myself, we had a very strong team. But we also had, an incredible team with, Fabio Schwartzman, Andre Kovri, and Toledo. Plus the teams from Petrobras and Braskem, worked together as a team. There was no divergence of interest. Everyone understood. I want, the fuel business here. I want the fuel business here. I want the petrochemical business here. The valuations, were done, quite professionally. And the Ipiranga, when you have a willing seller, which we did, as you well know, in the case of Ipiranga, that also makes the transaction go much more smoothly.
Yeah. I have to quote another good friend of mine, Frank Hagman.
Yes,
You know, Frank Hagman
I
was
do.
my boss before you were my boss.
Yes,
And Frank liked to say that in M&A, you can't have too many moving parts. It's like M&A is like doing puzzle in a bathroom, in a bathtub,
right.
right? So when you put a piece of the puzzle and you want to put the next piece, the water shakes it down and it already unsolved the rest of the puzzle. So when there's too many pieces, it's very difficult to tie them all together. And here we had too many pieces. My take on this is, which actually helped us to close the deal, was number one, we had a willing seller. That's very important. Number two, we had three uh, clients as buyer, but they needed each other because Petrobras wanted to buy Ipiranga, but the CADE, the antitrust regulatory agency in Brazil, wouldn't let them buy the whole Ipiranga deal. That's why we split Ipiranga in two. So there was a division line like the Portuguese and Spanish did for Brazil, for Latin America, right? I own from here, you own from there. So we did that.
Right.
Petrobras got the southeast to the north.
Right.
Ultrapar got the southeast and south.
Yeah.
Certain from the petrochemical side, certain assets went to Braskem, other assets went to Petrobras, also
Right.
avoiding antitrust issues.
Correct.
And I think the major challenge was treating all minorities fairly.
Fairly. Correct.
Because,
that's what I said from a valuation standpoint. The other things that I'm sure you and I've talked about in the past, and we should talk about in this discussion, is the transformational impact Ipiranga had on all three, but in particular on Ultrapar.
Yeah,
it was transformational in terms of changing the business of Ultrapar, which, as we know, had been a chemical, gas, cargo company to a large degree, and then getting into the fuel distribution company changed it very much so.
Yeah, and so getting into more detail here. So Ultrapar had Oxiteno, which was a second generation petrochemical company.
Correct.
And it was a niche player, very important. I always remember, I unfortunately don't remember his name, but he always talked about the aromatics component.
That was the term he used. That's right.
It was very funny. That guy was amazing. He was crucial for us closing this transaction. I'll remember his name. Anyways, then they have the LGP distribution, os botijões de gás, that was important.
Ultragás,
and they have the logistic business for petrochemicals.
Ultracargo
that made storage and transportation. So they had the know-how. And then they enter into the retailing of
the fuel distribution.
Fuel distribution, which is different, like same know-how, but different business, because now they're into retail.
Right.
Huge revenue, very small margin, and very interesting. After that, they expanded into retail. They invested in AMPM stores, like trying to gain, increase the points of sales. And then they enter into the pharma, in the drugstore business.
Right.
Which didn't really work well.
Well, yeah.
So,
but it was a fascinating transaction, and I do think important transaction because it sort of redefined fuel distribution in Brazil, and it certainly was transformational for Ultrapar.
Yeah, that was an amazing transaction. Very good for the sellers, great for the buyers, and transformational for Ultrapar. I'm very proud of that transaction. It was a $4.1 billion transaction,
Correct.
The largest I've done. Yeah.
Correct. And remember what I told you earlier. Arco do Brasil, Atlantique do Brasil, could have been acquired in 1987 for $200 million.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, amazing. And Steve, as we said, a key factor on this transaction was treating all minority shareholders fairly, and there was 6 minority shareholders for each one of the listed companies, 3 for Ipiranga, Braskem, Ultrapar, and Petrobras.
Right.
And in order to achieve that, to get there, to give the market, the regulator, the comfort, the valuation was crucial. We worked together on the valuation of Ultrapar and the 3 Ipiranga companies. And people don't know how much effort does it take. People don't know about valuation committees at large banks. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think will be educational, it not to say other things.
Well, yes. So there were a number of things that were required. An evaluation report, as you know, was one of the things that was required. And justifying the fairness of the transaction. And the way it works in investment banks is that that is done as an independent effort within the investment banks, so that the deal team itself presents to an independent group of senior bankers the merits of the valuation, so that the bank overall can approve and sign off on the fairness of the transaction. That report then is incorporated into the transaction documents, which are supplied to the relevant groups involved in the transaction, including the minority shareholders, the regulatory agencies, and all the respective parties.
Yeah. At Deutsche Bank, people don't know that, but when you have to sign a fairness opinion report or approve a valuation report, as we did, you have to go to a valuation committee. This valuation committee is comprised of the team who did all the valuation work, which was we, and it's sponsored by a managing director of this sector, and he was presenting the evaluation presentation to 3 other managing directors from the M&A department, mandatorily from other sectors. So we were presenting to the retail guy, we were representing to the healthcare guy, to other guys that know nothing about the business we were valuing.
And I want to make mention of another person, as you know, who was critical in this, both internally and externally, a brilliant lawyer, someone I've known for a long, long time, Paul Schnell of Skadden Arps.
Yeah.
Paul Schnell, as you well know, worked tirelessly, with us internally in terms of the appropriate approvals, for the valuation report and the fairness of the transaction, as well as he and his team helping us through the processes as far as the transaction itself.
Well, now that you mentioned Paul, I have to mention José Eduardo.
José Eduardo, which is it's a pity he's no longer with us, but yes.
Yeah, José Eduardo from Matos Filho, he was amazing.
He was outstanding. He was also a brilliant lawyer. You're right, and it's sad to think of him no longer here, but he was like Paul, brilliant in terms of this transaction. You are correct.
Yeah. So the whole bureaucracy, if I put it that way, is like this. So you had to prepare the evaluation report or the evaluation work, and then you had to present it to these 3 independent managing directors from the firm, but they are independent. They don't know anything about the business. What we present to them has to make sense, has to be consistent, has to be logical, has to be unchallengeable. And they understand the context of the transaction, they understand the context of the evaluation work, and Deutsche Bank's role, which is also important, and they'll give you feedback. And it's mandatory. You have to run 2 meetings, and you have to have a 24 hours gap between 2 meetings. Correct. In order to avoid, peer pressure. No, you have to approve this, and then you have the second meeting like 5 minutes after the first meeting. That doesn't make sense.
Right.
So we made the presentation. It went well, but they have asked for a couple of changes. Mm-hmm. We turned them around overnight, and the second day we presented again, and it was approved. And then only then we were able to present it to our client as a final report.
Right. That's right. And you're right. I mean, understanding the investor base, clearly the majority investor base is paramount, but understanding the investor base, when you have publicly traded companies, publicly traded both in Brazil and outside of Brazil, as you did, here, and directing, the views on the transaction, the views on value to the minority investors is critical, as well as to the to the regulators,
Yeah.
not just the exchange, but whether it be Kaji or any of the other related regulatory bodies.
Yeah. Steve, I worked a lot.
You
I,
did.
I gained a lot of weight. I made, wonderful friends because my analysts and associates, none of them were from Brazil.
That's right. That's
I
right.
had I had Hunter and I
Yep.
had Steve, both Americans. They weren't
Yep.
able to read the reports in Portuguese.
Right.
Then I got Guilherme Gama, who was an intern in Brazil, to help
Yep.
us out.
Yep.
Guilherme Gama came to the show, so you will be able to
see him.
To see him. But it was fantastic, tremendous outcome. I'm very proud of the transaction. Thank you a lot for giving me that opportunity. It was key for my career.
Well, you did a brilliant job. I know it. Our clients know it. The market knows it. You're a brilliant banker, and you did a brilliant job. And one of the most important merger and acquisition transactions that has ever occurred in Brazil.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. There's one final anecdote that I want to share with you.
Please.
Well, share with everybody. I've mentioned this before. I'm not sure if I mentioned in the show, but I've mentioned in other places. We were gathered together to discuss the valuation work. Big table. Everybody was there. Petrobras were there. Ultrapar was there. Braskem was there. The other advisors were there. Everybody were there. And there was this VP. We were co-advisors with, I don't remember the other firm. Anyways, so they were presenting the valuation, and Fabio Schwartzman asked, that's great, but I want to know the valuation of Ultrapar by the sum of the parts. I want to know how much have you valued Oxiteno, the gas distribution business, the logistic business, and how much do they add up? I don't want to know on aggregate. I want the sum of the parts. And the guy didn't know. He haven't done that work. And I was in the room and I'm watching was this. But I wasn't even in the table. Ian Reed was sitting on the table. I don't remember if you were there or not, but I was on the back, just watching the whole thing. And then I raised my hand like unsure, and I say, I've done that. I can show you. And Ian Reed looked at me. He didn't know I have that. And then I plugged my computer in the screen and I presented. And after that, I never unplugged my computer from the screen. It was Deutsche Bank running the show. And the reason I did that is because I was curious.
Right.
I wanted to know, so this is the evaluation. Does it make sense? So what happens if I look at each business separately with different discount rates, with different leverages? Is it coherent? Is it consistent? I wanted to know. Nobody asked me. I wanted to know because I was curious. And that curiosity paid back. So if you were listening to us and you forget everything you said and you remember just one thing, this is the one thing I want you to remember: be curious.
I agree. I was giving that speech to the younger people yesterday. They were asking about what makes a great banker, and I said, it's you're given a task. Don't just do the task. Think about what the task is and think about what else you want to learn from the task and do more than that. Be ahead of the people that are your mentors or your supervisors. Think outside the box. Don't just, don't just think A to B. Go A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Exactly, Steve. Well, thank you very much for this. It was fantastic.
Thank you, Jose.
Vocês provavelmente estão se inspirando na história que o entrevistado está contando para o Securato. E sabe o que todas as histórias têm em comum? Pessoas que se dedicaram e conseguiram atingir seus objetivos, e principalmente na educação. Então eu estou aqui agora para contar e para mostrar para vocês o Tablo. Ele é um marketplace de aulas online que tem como propósito ajudar vocês a encontrar o que você precisa e atingir os seus objetivos. Então a gente ajuda vocês a entrar no mercado financeiro, no mercado de trabalho, conseguir ganhar dinheiro com a gente. Então a gente tem uma linha de afiliado, conteudistas que conseguem ser remunerados. Para conhecer a gente, acesse www.tabula.com.br ou acompanhe a gente nas redes sociais.